The Valari Dominion did not count wars in bodies. They counted them in terawatts. To their grand strategist, Grand Legate Xylar, conflict was not a matter of blood, mud, or the desperate screams of dying infantry. It was a simple, elegant mathematical equation. You measured the enemy's total energy output, calculated their maximum shield dissipation frequency, deployed a fleet with exactly double that capacity, and watched the opposition dissolve into glowing atomic dust. It was clean. It was civilized. It was how the galaxy had been ruled for 1,000 cycles. When the Dominion's deep space reconnaissance scout ships first scanned the outer rim planet of New Duston, they didn't even bother to log it as a military threat. They found a human mining colony that didn't possess a secondary plasma grid, had no orbital surface lances, and relied on crude geothermal vents for basic atmospheric heat. To the high-born aristocrats of Valaria Prime, this wasn't an army, it was an administrative chore. A routine eviction of primitive squatters who had wandered too far from their minor homestar. Inside the sleek, ivory-white observation bridge of the Valari supercruiser Apex Mirror, Grand Legate Xylar adjusted his multi-spectrum optical lenses. His species was tall, slender, with skin like flawless, polished porcelain and narrow, vertical eyes that had never witnessed a single Imperial defeat. He was looking at a captured Terran defense weapon resting on a velvet-lined diagnostic table. It was a clunky, heavy, asymmetrical block of stamped industrial steel and dark, scratched polymer known to the human colonists as the M40 Ironclad. "Report on the primitive device," Xylar commanded, his voice carrying the light, melodic chime of his high-born lineage, completely devoid of any urgency. He didn't even look at the technician. His eyes were fixed on his manicured talons. Sub-Officer Vale bowed his long, elegant neck, his own silver armor clinking softly in the sterile, climate-controlled air of the bridge. "It is almost comical, Legate. Our laboratory specialists spent 3 full operational cycles trying to find the plasma containment core, the magnetic focusing lenses, or even a basic battery cell before they realized it doesn't have any of them. The weapon utilizes a violent, uncontrolled chemical explosion, a rapid ignition of sulfur, nitrates, and charcoal powder, to push a small, unrefined cylinder of solid lead through a rifled spiral tube." Xylar slowly turned his head, his vertical pupils dilating in genuine amusement. He let out a soft, rhythmic clicking laugh that resonated through the quiet bridge. "A chemical explosion? They are fighting with microvolcanoes, Vale. They are using the tech of primitives who have just discovered fire. What is the energy efficiency of such a device? Less than 0.04% compared to our standard issue plasma sidearms, sir," Vale replied, using a pair of magnetic tweezers to hold up a small, heavy, copper-jacketed bullet between his long, delicate fingers. "The projectile has no guiding sensor, no tracking frequency, no internal explosive payload, and no heat-seeking vector. It is literally just a piece of fast-moving dirt. If our soldiers stand behind their standard crystalline thermal shields, these objects will simply flatten against the energy field and fall into the dust like dead insects." Xylar waved his lower left hand in lazy dismissal, turning his back to the weapon and looking down at the grand holographic projection of New Duston. "They are playing with toys from their species' childhood. Order the forward vanguard divisions to land immediately. Do not waste the power of our heavy orbital lances on this world. It would be aesthetically unrefined to use an absolute laser against an enemy that fights with rocks. Let the infantry clear the landing zones with standard light bars." Down on the surface of New Duston, inside a massive, reinforced cavernous hangar dug deep into the side of a sulfur-stained mountain, the air was a thick, breathing mixture of heavy industrial oil, burning welding rods, and the bitter smell of stale coffee. This was not a military base. It was a repair bay for heavy mining equipment, and it belonged entirely to Chief Engineer Toby Mach Mackenzie. Mach was 60 years old, with a wild beard that looked like it had been washed in diesel fuel and hands so scarred and calloused from decades of handling heavy machinery that he could probably deflect a minor plasma spark with his bare skin. He was currently leaning over the bed of a heavy-duty mining rig, his face illuminated by the harsh, flickering orange light of a plasma torch. Bolted securely to the reinforced flatbed was a monstrous, six-barreled rotary cannon. It didn't have the clean, aerodynamic lines of alien technology. It looked like an angry, prehistoric beast made of thick iron pipes, exposed driving gears, and heavy hydraulic hoses that leaked black grease onto the floor. Mach, the outer sensor perimeter just went completely dark. General Marcus Vance called out, his heavy combat boots slamming against the steel grating of the workshop's upper catwalk. Vance was a veteran of the brutal Rim Wars, his face scarred by an old alien energy burn that had melted half his jaw into a permanent, grim sneer. He wasn't wearing dress whites or decorated medals. He wore heavy, grease-stained combat fatigues, a tactical vest loaded with heavy metal magazines, and carried a short, ugly double-barreled shotgun slung across his broad chest. Mach didn't even lift his head from the rotary cannon's heavy mechanical feeding mechanism. He used a dirty, oil-soaked rag to wipe a fresh layer of sweat and grit from his forehead. That means their fancy cloaked dropships just touched down in the northern salt flats, Marcus. Those pretty white boats of theirs displacement a massive amount of atmospheric air when they try to hover. You don't need a sensor grid to know they're here. You can smell the ozone from 3 miles away. The scouts from the ridge are reporting that the aliens aren't even dropping their heavy mobile shield generators from the drop craft, Vance said, leaping down from the ladder and leaning against a stack of heavy wooden crates. Each crate was stenciled with bold, black letters. Ammo .50 BMG, Kinetic solid. Mach let out a rough, hacking laugh that turned into a cough. Of course they aren't bringing the heavy shields, Marcus. They ran their high-altitude orbital scans, saw we don't have any glowing energy signatures, no plasma batteries, and no nuclear reactors up here. Their computers told them we're just a bunch of dirt farmers with sharp sticks and rusty tractors. They think war is a mathematics test, and they think they've already got the answers. Vance unlatched the heavy breech of his shotgun, dropping a massive, heavy brass shell filled with hand-packed lead buckshot into the chamber. The mechanical clack-clack of the weapon closing was incredibly loud in the echoing hangar. Well, let's see how their fancy computers handle a live demonstration of old-fashioned Terran physics. The 1st Valari Infantry Division marched onto the dazzling white salt flats of New Duston in perfect, unbroken, glittering columns. Their armor was a masterpiece of high-born military science, composed of layered crystalline weave that could absorb, distribute, and completely dissipate up to 10,000 degrees of thermal plasma energy. Ahead of the infantry columns walked 3 light skimmer tanks, their white, porcelain-like hulls levitating effortlessly 2 feet above the white sand on humming magnetic cushions. Sub-Officer Vale led the column from the open bridge of the center skimmer tank. Through his integrated helmet HUD, he could see the human defense lines half a kilometer away. There were no pulsing energy barriers, no humming anti-air grids, and no automated laser turrets. There was only a low, jagged wall of piled sandbags, rusted structural iron plates, and dirty timber supports dug into the white salt. They aren't even powering up their targeting systems, Sub-Officer Bale's communications tech noted from the lower console, his voice completely relaxed, almost bored. Our passive electronic warfare scanners show 0 electromagnetic activity in the enemy trench line. It's completely dead. They have nothing to power up, Vale replied, resting his upper hands casually on the polished rail of his skimmer. They are probably hiding in the deep mud at the bottom of those holes, hoping our Imperial Census officers will be gentle when we hand them the relocation paperwork. Activate the forward thermal shields just as a standard operational precaution. Let us finish this chore before the first sun sets so we can get back to the flagship for the evening meal. The 3 alien skimmers accelerated, their grav drives making a high-pitched, musical whine that echoed across the quiet, wide salt flats. To the Valari soldiers, this wasn't a battle, it was a field inspection of an inferior property that was being cleared for development. Inside the human trenches, Private First Class Elias Cole pressed his cheek against the cold, scratched steel stock of his M40 rifle. His hands were sweating inside his combat gloves, but his grip on the weapon was absolute. Beside him, an old sergeant named Miller was chewing on the stub of an unlit cigar, his squinting eyes fixed on the gleaming white alien shields moving steadily across the sand like mirages. "Wait for the marker, kid," Miller whispered, his voice as rough and dry as sandpaper. "Don't fire when you see their lights. Don't fire when you hear their engines. You wait until you can see the reflection of your own trench in their pretty white armor plates. Sergeant." Those shields stopped a full-powered industrial cutting laser during the mining riots last year, Elias said, his voice tight with anxiety as his finger hovered over the trigger guard. Miller didn't take his eyes off the flats. He slowly shifted the cigar to the other side of his mouth. "A mining laser is light, Elias. Light travels in waves, and shields are built to scatter waves. The Earth doesn't move in waves when a man wants to break your jaw. It moves in an absolute straight line." At exactly 400 meters, the lead Valari skimmer tank crossed a faded, pale white line that Mac McKenzie had painted on the salt sand using an old mining truck that morning. "Now," Miller growled. Elias Cole squeezed the trigger. The M40 ironclad did not make a clean, futuristic zap or a polite hum like the alien weapons. It exploded with a deafening, thunderous crack that shook the loose dirt straight out of the sandbags. A thick, pungent cloud of gray gunsmoke erupted from the muzzle brake, filling the trench with the harsh smell of burnt sulfur and hot grease. Up on the lead alien skimmer, Sub-Officer Vale didn't even flinch when his automated shield warning system chimed a low alert. He expected the minor energy spike to register on his HUD and immediately fade as the crystal weave dissipated the heat. Instead, a terrifying, metallic bang echoed across the salt flats. The 20-ton levitating platform didn't just absorb the hit, it staggered violently backward. The vehicle's magnetic cushions coughed a brilliant spray of blue sparks as the nose of the skimmer dipped sharply into the white sand, throwing 2 deck officers off their feet. "Report," Vale screamed, his upper arms gripping the control console for dear life as his seat harness locked down. "Did they hit us with a heavy plasma cannon? Where is the thermal energy signature on the scanner?" "There is no thermal signature, sir," the technical officer yelled, his vertical eyes wide with absolute panic as his monitor began flashing bright red warning sequences. Something physical and incredibly dense just slammed into our forward armor arc at 2,000 meters per second. The shield didn't dissipate it because the object has zero thermal charge. The energy shield tried to stop it with pure magnetic resistance, and the raw kinetic transfer just crushed our forward stabilization fins. Before Vale could process the physics of the report, the entire half-mile length of the human trench line erupted into a solid, unbroken wall of thunderous sound. It was a relentless, rhythmic hammer of physical explosions that turned the air between the trenches into a screaming corridor of flying, supersonic metal. The Valari infantry columns, trained to dance through advanced plasma beams by simply twisting their thermal armor layers to match the incoming frequency, found themselves completely helpless in front of the human lead storm. A standard Valari shield was an artistic achievement. It caught an incoming energy bolt, broke its atomic frequency, and scattered its heat harmlessly across a wide surface area. But a half-ounce piece of solid, heavy lead jacketed in copper does not possess a frequency. It has mass, it has velocity, and it has an attitude. When the bullet hit the alien energy shield, the shield worked exactly as it was programmed to do. It remained solid. But because the bullet was solid too, the entire kinetic energy of the impact could not be scattered. It transferred directly into the physical mounting brackets of the shield generator itself. Across the front line, the delicate, high-frequency alien shield modules began to explode one by one, not from thermal overload, but from the raw, mechanical vibration of 40,000 impacts per second. The delicate crystals inside the generators were literally being rattled into sand. "Our shields are fracturing. The matrix is tearing itself apart." A Valari Centurion screamed through the command network, his voice completely stripping away all Imperial elegance as he watched his unit disappear into a cloud of white salt dust and blood. The impacts are too heavy. The armor isn't melting, it's shattering like frozen glass. A concentrated burst of heavy .50 caliber rounds from Mach's converted mining rig caught the second alien skimmer tank. The massive, finger-length slugs tore straight through the glowing white energy shield, punched through the sleek, ivory-white composite hull as if it were wet cardboard, and detonated the internal high-pressure cooling tanks behind the engine. The skimmer didn't dissolve into light or leave a clean thermal burn. It flipped completely over in a spectacular, ugly wreck of twisting iron, black oil smoke, and screaming soldiers. From the high observation bridge of the apex mirror, Grand Legate Xylar watched his perfect holographic tactical map dissolve into a sea of flashing red warning icons. "What is happening down there?" he demanded, his white, porcelain skin turning a pale, sickly shade of green. "Why are their primitive weapons completely bypassing our defensive matrix?" "They aren't bypassing it, Legate," his chief military analyst whispered, his hands trembling over the diagnostic data stream. "They are overloading the physical engineering of our technology. Their weapons don't care about our energy equations. They are using raw, unrefined mass to smash through our logic." Sub-Officer Vale's skimmer tank was dragging its broken rear steering fin through the white sand, leaving a deep, ugly scar in the flats as it retreated toward the northern ridge. The perfect, elegant columns of the Valari infantry had completely disintegrated. Imperial soldiers who had conquered 3-star systems without ever getting a single speck of dirt on their polished boots were now crawling through the salt mud, trying to find cover behind the burning, twisted wreckage of their own vehicles. "Fall back to the primary communication relay tower," Vale ordered through his failing, static-choked comms unit, his upper left arm clutching a deep, jagged shrapnel wound in his shoulder. The wound didn't look like a clean, cauterized laser cut. It was jagged, torn, and leaking dark purple blood, the classic, messy mark of a low-tech metal fragment. "Establish a hard defensive perimeter around the generator base. Call orbit for a full planetary bombardment. Burn this entire coordinates from space." Inside the human lines, General Marcus Vance stood on top of a sandbag reinforcement wall, his shotgun resting casually on his shoulder as he watched the frantic alien retreat through his old mechanical binoculars. "They're grouping up at the old communications tower, Mach. They think those 3-foot concrete barriers we built last year are going to protect them from a real gun." Mac Mackenzie walked up beside him, carrying a massive steel box of specialized ammunition that clinked with an incredibly heavy, metallic ring. These rounds weren't bright brass. They were long, matte black, and tipped with a dark, heavy metal that looked like industrial drill bits used for cutting through granite cores. "Let him group up," Mac said, a grim, oily smile spreading across his wrinkled face as he spat onto the trench floor. "I've been waiting 3 years to test the heavy stuff on something that can talk back. Hey, Elias, get the tractor team to roll out the Big Bertha cannon. Let's show these fancy space birds what happens when you bring a knife to an artillery fight." The surviving Valari Dominion forces had managed to establish a tight defensive ring around the central colonial relay tower, using their surviving light armor units to create a continuous wall of high-frequency plasma fire that kept the human infantry from advancing across the wide, open flats. "We have stable high-energy shields active now," Vale reported to orbit, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as a human medic drone he had captured hummed uselessly nearby. "If they try to bring those mechanical trucks closer, our plasma cannons will melt them before they can get into range." "The orbital flagship is aligning its main batteries," Xylar's voice came back, cold and hollow through the static. "Hold your position for 10 more minutes, Vale. I will personally turn that mining mountain into a crater of liquid stone." Before Vale could respond, a strange, low, rhythmic whistling sound began to drift down from the upper atmosphere. It wasn't the clean, silent hum of an incoming orbital laser. It was a deep, tearing screech that sounded as if the sky itself were being ripped apart by a giant pair of shears. Screech, 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 seismic warning, the alien terminal yelled. Massive physical projectiles detected in the upper trajectory. Mass variance, 2,000 kilograms per unit. Velocity, Mach 6. Vale looked up through his visor. High above the salt flats, falling straight down from the clouds, were three massive, black cylinders of solid, unrefined tungsten carbide steel. They didn't have engines, they didn't have guidance fins, and they didn't carry a single drop of explosive payload. They were just raw, kinetic telephone poles dropped from a mass driver cannon dug into the mountain. The lead tungsten rod hit the center of the Valari defense ring. The high-frequency energy shield didn't even register a thermal change before the physical weight of the 2-ton steel bar hit it. The shield didn't scatter the hit. The generator module underneath the sand was driven 5 meters deep into the solid granite bedrock, instantly vaporizing the electronics under the sheer weight of the impact. The shockwave alone lifted the alien skimmers 3 feet into the air, shattering the bones of every soldier within 50 meters without firing a single shot of plasma. Inside the apex mirror, Grand Legate Xylar stood before his command console, his forearms trembling so violently he could barely type the codes to activate his ship's primary weapon system. The tactical map was no longer showing an equation, it was showing a slaughter. His Vanguard division was 90% non-functional, not because their armor had failed, but because the physical impact of the human bullets had turned the internal electronics of their suits into melted copper and broken glass. Legate, his chief helmsman shouted, his vertical eyes wide with absolute panic. The human colony. They aren't targeting our ground forces anymore. Their ground-based mass drivers are shifting their angles. They are pointing directly at us. Xylar's jaw dropped. They are pointing at orbit? From the ground? With primitive kinetic tubes? That is impossible. They cannot pierce our magnetic deflector shields from the planet's surface. Sir, our deflector shields are calibrated to repel high-velocity ion particles and plasma torpedoes. The helmsman yelled back as the ship's proximity sensors began to scream in a terrifying, continuous tone. A solid tungsten slug doesn't have an ion charge. The magnetic field won't deflect it. It will just let it pass straight through. Before Xylar could give the order to move the ship, a massive, deafening boom shook the entire 3-kilometer length of the supercruiser. The ship didn't glow with energy shields. The sound was the horrific, screeching noise of 3 tons of solid human steel punching a clean, 5-meter-wide hole through the ivory armor of the lower hull, passing straight through the officers' quarters, and exiting out the top deck into the vacuum of space. The atmospheric alarms began to wail across the bridge, their red lights reflecting off Xylar's pale, terrified face. Damage report. Xylar screamed, his lower arms grabbing his command chair as the ship groaned under the stress of the decompression. Hull breach in sectors 4 through 9. The tech officer cried, his hands flying across a terminal that was rapidly dying. The projectile. It didn't explode, sir. It just kept moving. It tore through our primary antimatter containment lines by pure physical displacement. We've lost 40% of our orbital maneuverability. Down on the surface, Mac Mackenzie stood near the breech of the massive mass driver cannon, using an industrial crane to drop another long, matte black tungsten rod into the loading tray. He was whistling an old Terran folk song, his face covered in fresh hydraulic fluid. Angle looks good, Mac, General Vance said, checking the satellite track on his slate. You hit him right in the storage bays. They're leaking plasma gas all over the upper atmosphere. Looks like a big purple firework up there. They always forget the basic laws of the universe, Marcus, Mac said, pulling the heavy hydraulic lever to lock the breech shut. They think because they can warp space, they're bigger than Newton. But Sir Isaac Newton is the baddest bastard in the galaxy once you give him a long enough tube and enough gunpowder. Fire when ready, Mac, Vance said, turning his back to the cannon and covering his ears. Let's see if they want to stay for the third lesson. Grand Legate Xylar was no longer looking at his conquest medals. He was looking at the evacuation pods currently launching from his flagship's lower bays. The apex mirror, the pride of the Valari Dominion's 7th Fleet, was drifting slowly toward the upper atmosphere of New Duston, its beautiful ivory hull scarred by 3 perfectly round, jagged exit holes that no energy matrix could repair. Marshal Orax is demanding an update, Legate, the comms officer whispered, his voice completely broken. He wants to know why the planetary pacification is taking so long. Xylar looked at the screen. On it, the small, low-tech human colony looked exactly as it had that morning, a dirty, rugged collection of mining huts and rusted metal hangars. There was no grandeur to them, no elegant architecture. They were just a people who knew how to dig holes and throw heavy things very, very hard. Tell the Marshal, Xylar said, his voice dropping into a whisper as another tungsten slug tore through the ship's secondary engine array, cutting the lights on the bridge completely. Tell him that the humans do not fight for the sky. They fight for the ground. And if we try to take it from them, they will use their ground to bring down our sky. By the time the suns of New Duston finally dipped below the horizon, the salt flats had gone completely quiet. The high-pitched whine of alien skimmers had been replaced by the crackle of burning polymer and the low, steady rumble of human diesel trucks moving through the wreckage. Sub-Officer Vale sat on the rusted bumper of an abandoned human tractor, his upper arms wrapped in heavy gauze, his sleek silver armor covered in thick, white salt dust. He was looking down at his feet, where a single, spent human rifle casing lay in the sand. It was a simple piece of stamped brass, empty and cold, but to him, it looked like the monument of a broken empire. General Marcus Vance walked up to him, his heavy combat boots crunching loudly on the salt. He didn't have his rifle drawn, it was slung casually across his back. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, metal flask, offering it to the alien officer. Kerosene and old cherries, Vance said, taking a sip himself when Vale didn't move. We call it whiskey. Helps clear the sulfur out of your throat. Vale slowly lifted his vertical eyes, his voice carrying none of its old aristocratic melody. Why do you still use these? These barbaric things. You have the industrial capacity to build plasma arrays. We scanned your manufacturing cores before we landed. You chose to stay primitive. Vance laughed, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from his boots. A plasma rifle is a beautiful piece of engineering, son. But if a solar flare hits the valley, your fancy gun turns into an expensive paperweight. If a grain of sand gets into your focal lens, the whole thing explodes in your face. But a piece of lead and a steel spring? You can drop it in the mud, run it over with a tractor, bury it in the salt for 10 years. And when you pull that trigger, it's still going to do exactly what it was born to do. He pointed out toward the burning remains of the apex mirror currently trailing a long line of black smoke across the sky. We don't build things to be pretty, Vale. We build things to last until the fight is done. 3 weeks later, inside the grand, marble-walled halls of the Valari High Court on the core world of Valaria Prime, a silence hung over the assembly that had not been felt in a century. Grand Legate Xylar stood at the center of the judicial circle, his ceremonial robes replaced by a simple officer's tunic, his 4 hands held tightly behind his back. Above him, the high counselors looked down from their floating benches, their faces dark with political humiliation. You lost an entire vanguard division and a super cruiser to a population of less than 50,000 frontier miners. The High Sovereign boomed, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The Imperial records state that the enemy did not possess a single capital ship or orbital defense grid. Explain this equation, Xylar. Xylar didn't look up at the judges. He reached into his pocket and placed a single, heavy object onto the central metal pedestal. It was a solid, dented 500-grain tungsten slug that Mach Mackenzie had dug out of the flagship's wreckage before it was scrapped. We went to war against an enemy we thought was behind us in the evolutionary line, Xylar said, his voice level and devoid of any excuse. We believed that because we had mastered the spectrum of energy, We had mastered the universe. But the universe is not just energy, sovereigns. It is also mass. And when a human looks at an equation, he doesn't see a numbers test. He sees a hammer. He looked up, his vertical eyes fixing on the high sovereign. If we send another fleet to the rim, they will lose that fleet too. Not because the humans are smarter, or because their empire is larger, but because you cannot break a species that has learned how to turn the very laws of physics into a weapon of pure spite. Back on New Duston, the human colony wasn't celebrating a grand galactic victory. They were doing what they always did after a storm. They were cleaning up the yard. Inside the primary hangar, Mac Mackenzie was already working on a new modification for the mass driver cannons, using pieces of the salvaged Valari flagship hull to line the internal firing tracks. The sleek, silver metal of the alien ship looked strange when welded to the rough, dark iron of the human cannon, but Mac didn't care about aesthetics. He cared about velocity. "Hey Mac," Elias Cole said, walking into the shop with a crate of fresh copper ingots. "The scouts say the Dominion fleet has completely pulled back past the third moon. They're setting up a neutral trade zone instead of an occupation line." Mac didn't stop his welding torch, the bright blue sparks illuminating his dirty face. "Of course they are. Once a bully knows you can throw a rock through his window from 3 blocks away, he stops coming into your driveway." General Vance stepped into the light, a fresh cigar tucked into his scarred jaw. "They're going to try to buy our kinetic blueprints, Mac. The diplomats from the core worlds are already sending messages. They want to know the exact chemical formula for our propellant powder." Mac turned off his torch, lifting his mask with a wide, greasy grin. "Tell them the formula is a secret human colonial recipe. Tell them it's passed down from an old Earth king named Newton. Let them spend 10 cycles trying to run that through their computers. By the time they figure out it's just sulfur, dirt, and a lot of attitude, we'll have the next batch of bigger bullets ready for 'em." The war for New Duston had changed the balance of the Outer Rim in a single day. Across the frontier star systems, other human colonies looked at the reports from the salt flats and stopped trying to buy expensive, delicate alien plasma arrays from core world traders. They restarted their old steel foundries, recalibrated their mechanical stamping machines, and began churning out millions of rounds of simple, heavy kinetic ammunition. To the alien empires watching from the deep dark of space, the human territory began to look less like a frontier colony and more like a massive, defensive porcupine made of cold steel and iron barrels. "They aren't expanding their borders," a Valari analyst noted during a secret defense briefing on Valaria Prime. "They are just thickening their walls. Every time we scan a human world now, we don't find energy signatures. We just find millions of tons of solid metal pointing at the sky." "Do we invade the next sector?" a young legate asked, his hand hovering over the mobilization maps. The chief analyst slowly closed the holographic display, turning his back to the war room. "Only if you want to find out how many telephone poles they can drop on your ship before you can finish your victory speech. Leave them alone. The humans are content to stay in their dirt, as long as you don't make them remind you what their dirt is made of." The white sand of New Duston's flats caught the cold silver light of the planet's twin moons as General Marcus Vance walked his final perimeter patrol of the week. The air was cool, the smell of sulfur finally fading back into the natural scent of the desert rock. He stopped near the edge of Trench 4, where Private Elias Cole was sitting on an empty ammo crate, his M40 rifle resting securely across his lap. The young soldier was carefully running an oily cleaning patch down the long steel barrel of his weapon, his movements slow, rhythmic, and respectful. "She treated you well out there, kid?" Vance asked, leaning against a nearby sandbag. Elias looked up, his face silhouetted by the moonlight. He tapped the stamped steel receiver of the rifle. "She didn't miss a beat, General. When the alien skimmer came over that ridge, I thought my heart was going to burst. But then I felt the kick of the stock against my shoulder. It felt solid, like the ground under my boots wasn't going to let me fall." Vance smiled, his scarred jaw softening in the silver light. He looked up at the empty sky, where the stars were bright, clean, and completely free of Valari warships. That's the secret they'll never understand up there in their clean ships, Elias, Vance said softly, taking his cigar from his mouth and pointing it toward the deep dark of space. They think power is something you generate in a reactor core. They think it's something you can turn off with a switch or hack with a computer program. He walked over, his heavy boot stepping firmly onto the solid, unyielding earth of the trench floor. But real power? Real power is just mass and acceleration. It's the weight of the world you're defending, moving fast enough to break whatever tries to change it. They can keep their lasers and their light shows, kid. As long as humanity holds the steel, we own the deep. The young soldier nodded, sliding the clean bolt back into his rifle with a sharp, heavy clack that cut through the quiet night air like a promise. And out on the frontier of the galaxy, the iron remained loaded, waiting for anyone foolish enough to laugh at the rocks again.